Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. I'm Adnan Yilmaz. I'm a PhD graduate of Second Language Acquisition and Teaching program at the University of Arizona. Currently I work at a state university in Turkey. Today I'm going to make a presentation titled Communication Across Cultures, Research on Apologies and Refusals. I would like to start my presentation with two different quotes from two different interviewees who participated in my dissertation research. Here is the first one. While I was at the language school in Syracuse, I went to the library to borrow a laptop. I took my place in line at the desk where we borrowed materials from the school. While waiting for my turn, I was thinking about what words and structures to use in my question for the librarian. Should I say, "Can I get a laptop?" "May I get a laptop?" Or "Can I get or take?" I was also thinking about a verb. Should I use get or take? Should I use the auxiliary of can or may? I was totally confused. Luckily, there was a female student right in front of me, and she also asked to borrow something. I guess she asked to borrow a laptop too. Anyway, she said, "Can I get a laptop?" That was the moment when I discovered what sentence to use. I think we learn what to say where as we get exposed to language. The next one reads as, "Gestures are really very important in communication. We use some of them consciously and some of them unconsciously. I have an interesting example for this. In the 1970s and 1980s, Americans signed agreements with Arabs to buy oil. At that time, the oil prices were not as important as they are now. While signing the agreements, Americans discovered a tricky point about Arabs. They understood whether or not they offered a good deal by merely looking at how wide the eyes of Arabs were when they heard it. Arabs learned this fact much later. That is why they wore sunglasses during the meetings thereafter. Can you think of that? I guess they learned this fact by getting some help from some experts in communication. So what I mean is that only language is not enough for communication. It could be spoken or written language. There are several other things that complement communication among people. We have different senses that help work simultaneously during communication. For instance, we hear, see, and so forth. Even our distance from the listener has some effect on communication. In these quotes, I would like to draw your attention to the following points, in particular to the bold utterances. I was thinking about what words and structures to use in my question. Only language is not enough for communication. There are several other things that complement communication among people. Even our distance from the listener has some effect on communication. The bold words highlight the significance of the tools that we need for communication. One of these tools is obviously language, but of course, language is not the only tool that we use to communicate. As noted by the second interviewee, we also use some other tools to communicate. Social semioticians like Halliday, Hodge & Kress, Crumsch, and Van Leeuwen assert that what we need for communication is semiotic resources. Semiotic resources are the tools or means that we use to communicate meaning. Building on pragmatic aspect of these meaning-making tools, I classify semiotic resources into two categories: semiopragmatic resources and socio-semiopragmatic resources. The former category includes language, aspect of voice modification, physical contact, space, gestures and movements, eye contact, smell, and silence. And I refer to the ability to use these semiopragmatic resources as semiopragmatic competence. The latter category includes social power, social distance, gender, degree of imposition, social identity. And I refer to the ability to use these socio-semiopragmatic resources as socio-semiopragmatic competence. As we have seen in the previous slide, there are numerous semiotic resources in a socio-semiotically contexted world of human beings. Even human beings themselves are semiotic resources. To be able to understand how humans socialize into these social semiotic resources for their semiotic or meaning potential in communication, we need to conduct ethnographic studies within or across communities of practice. Such studies can help draw a holistic picture of the socioculturally or socio-semiotically contexted nature of communication. In the related literature, different approaches and models or theories are suggested to account for the socioculturally or socio-semiotically contexted nature of communication. Heim's communicative competence approach is definitely a pillar in this respect. Based on this approach, 3 different models of communicative competence and intercultural communicative competence inform the conceptual framework of this study. The first one is Silsa Mercian's revised model of communicative competence. The second one is Byram's intercultural communicative competence model. And the last one is Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. Before dwelling on the conceptual framework of this study, it would be better to provide a critique of the existing models of communicative competence or intercultural communicative competence. The critique of ICC can be divided into two categories, conceptual and operational. The former includes the confusion with the definition of the concept of competence, the dichotomy of intercultural communication as performance or competence, the culture-general or culture-specific approaches to ICC, the restriction of ICC models to one or at most two of the three aspects suggested as affective, cognitive, and behavioral, and the restriction of intercultural communication or communication only to language. The later category includes how to locate ICC, how to approach ICC, and how to measure or assess ICC. Based on these critiques, Chen and Storsa suggest that ICC should be considered from three different and yet related aspects: affective, cognitive, and behavioral, and they call it as interactive multicultural building. The affective aspect is built on the notions of self-concept, open-mindedness, non-judgmental attitudes, and social relaxation. The cognitive aspect is related to the evolution of the personal thinking about the distinctive features or characteristics of one's own and other semiotic resources and sociocultural contexts, namely self-awareness or monitoring and cultural awareness. The former includes concern with social appropriateness of one's self-presentation, attention to social comparison information as cues to situationally appropriate expressive self-presentation, the ability to control and modify one's self-presentation, the use of this ability in particular situations, and the modification of one's expressive behavior to meet the requirements of particular situations. The latter focuses on the perception and knowledge of the norms and conventions in one's own and others' cultures, which influence how people think and behave. The behavioral aspect is concerned with message skills, appropriate self-disclosure, behavioral flexibility, interaction management, and communication skills. Building on the affective cognitive behavioral view of ICC, I proposed an alternative model of ICC in which I identified 7 different competencies, including semiopragmatic, socio-semiopragmatic, discourse, interactional, intercultural, strategic, and intercultural sensitivity. Strategic competence and intercultural sensitivity rotate around the other competencies because they exist at every stage of intercultural communication. In the existing literature on foreign language teaching and learning, there are no studies that investigate the phenomenon of ICC from these 3 aspects. Therefore, this research serves as a breakthrough in the LT context. With this gap in mind, this study aimed to answer the following research questions. Considering the affective aspect of ICC, there is one question, and it is, what level of intercultural sensitivity do ELT students have to the English-speaking socio-semiotic context? Considering the behavioral aspect of ICC, there are 2 questions. The first one, what overall intercultural performance do ELT students have in using English to make apologies and refusals? And the second one, what relationship exists between ELT students' intercultural sensitivity to the English-speaking socio-semiotic context and their overall intercultural performance in using English? Considering the cognitive aspect of ICC, there are 3 different questions. The first one is, how do ELT students define successful intercultural communication? Second one, what differences have ELT students observed between the Turkish and the English-speaking socio-semiotic contexts? And third one, what do ELT students posit as the sources of the intercultural communicative challenges or breakdowns they encounter in the English-speaking socio-semiotic context? To be able to answer these questions, I used a mixed methods convergent parallel research design to conduct my study. In this type of design, there are both quantitative and qualitative strands to collect data. The data are collected and analyzed separately, but are merged in the interpretation process to draw sound conclusions. I carried out a study in the Department of English Language Teaching at a state university in Turkey. The participants of the study consisted of two different groups, including study informants and raters. As the study informants, 30 freshman ALT students participated in the study. They were all born in Turkey and learned English as a foreign language. As for the raters, two independent L1 speakers of English participated in the study. They had PhD degree and worked as assistant professors of second language teaching in two different US universities. In this table, you can see detailed demographic information about the study informants. But I would like to draw your attention to their language background and experience of being abroad. As you can see in the table, while 18 of them had Turkish as their heritage language, 12 of them had Kurdish. Turkish was all the study informants' first language. Considering their knowledge of other languages, all of them knew English and 9 of them also knew some other language, such as French, German, Japanese, and so forth. They all learned English at school, and 3 of them also went to a private course to learn English. The majority of the students had no experience of being abroad. Of those who had been abroad, only 3 of them went to an English-speaking country. Considering their language proficiency, they reported to have an average or intermediate level of overall language proficiency, with the highest score in reading and the lowest score in speaking. To elicit data, I used 3 different tools, namely an Intercultural Sensitivity Scale, a Discourse Completion Test, and semi-structured interviews. The ICC consisted of 2 different parts, Background Survey and Intercultural Sensitivity Scale. The scale had 24 items categorized under 5 factors that you see in the slide. It had a reliability value of 0.83. The DCT consisted of 12 scenarios, including 6 apologies and 6 refusals. In the formation of the scenarios, the socio-semiopragmatic variables of social power, social distance, and gender were taken into consideration. The DCT had a reliability value of 0.89. Regarding the semi-structured interviews, 3 group and 3 individual interviews were conducted, and they were conducted in Turkish. This table provides detailed information about the topics of the scenarios and the distribution of the socio-semiopragmatic variables of social power and social distance. To analyze the data, I used both quantitative and qualitative paradigms. For quantitative analysis, I used descriptive statistics and regression. In the interpretation of the mean values, I had 3 different categories: low, average, and high. As for the qualitative analysis, I used deductive, inductive, and content analysis. Now it is time to present the findings. Considering the effective aspect of ICC, the student had an average level of intercultural sensitivity, which is, as can be seen, very close to a high level. They had the highest level in the factor of respect for cultural differences and the lowest in interaction confidence. Considering the behavioral aspect of ICC, I would like you to first focus on the overall column. As you can see, the student had an average level of intercultural performance in the total of both communicative acts and in the total of each communicative act. Now, I want you to focus on the semiopragmatics column. The student had an average level of semiopragmatic competence in the total of both communicative acts and in the total of each communicative act. Likewise, if you look at the socio-semiopragmatic column, we can see that they had an average level of socio-semiopragmatic competence in the total of both communicative acts and in the total of each communicative act. Considering the connection between the ALT students' intercultural sensitivity to the English-speaking socio-semiotic context and their overall intercultural performance in using English, no significant relationship was found. Considering the cognitive aspect of ICC, the ALT students focused on 3 variables to define successful intercultural communication. These are semiopragmatic competence, socio-semiopragmatic competence, and intercultural sensitivity. As for the diversities or differences observed between the Turkish and the English-speaking socio-semiotic context, the students focused on semiopragmatic and socio-semiopragmatic differences. For instance, they noted that the conception and understanding of social power and distance vary across cultures, and thus the sociocultural dynamics that an intercultural speaker should consider when communicating meaning vary across cultures as well. Regarding the sources of intercultural communicative challenges or breakdowns encountered in the English-speaking socio-semiotic context, the students posited semiopragmatic differences, socio-semiopragmatic differences, lack of exposure and socialization, language learning practices, socio-semiopragmatic transfer, and effective barriers as the basic challenges. In general, the student had an average level of intercultural sensitivity to the English-speaking socio-semiotic context. Considering the 5 factors in the ICC, the informants showed a fluctuation between ethnocentrism and ethnorelativism. The fluctuation stemmed from the psychological adaptation to differences and the unity of emotions, personality, and context in lived experiences. The quantitative and qualitative findings indicated that refusals were the most difficult communicative act for ELT students. This results from a strong discouragement of refusing in the Turkish socio-semiotic context. In general, they attained an average level of semiopragmatic and socio-semiopragmatic performance in both communicative acts, with the latter being lower than the former. This difference stems from the fact that the acquisition of socio-semiopragmatic resources is more difficult than that of semiopragmatic resources. Cohen and Alston note that because communicative acts consist of a series of acts, they have complex natures and thus pose challenges to L2 speakers. The quantitative analysis indicated no significant relationship between the affective and behavioral aspect of ICC. However, the qualitative analysis revealed a significant relationship. Therefore, further studies should be carried out to decipher the relationship between these 2 aspects. Similar to the findings in the related literature, the interviewees identified 3 major components of successful intercultural communication: semiopragmatics, socio-semiopragmatics, and intercultural sensitivity. In line with the related literature, the interviewees identified 3 different and yet interwoven categories of diversities, including semiopragmatic and socio-semiopragmatic. For instance, Dufon notes that the T versus we forms in French and German languages are rather complicated for L1 English speakers to acquire because such a difference does not exist in English. The interviewees identified the sources of intercultural communicative challenges or breakdowns as semiopragmatic and socio-semiopragmatic differences, lack of exposure and socialization, existing language learning practices, socio-semiopragmatic transfer, and effective barriers like fear of failure, anxiety, and so forth. Similar to these findings, Al-Issa found that for Jordanian EFL learners, sociocultural transfer stands out as a major challenge to successful intercultural communication. Communication cannot be restricted only to language because humans use various semiotic resources to communicate particular social and cultural meanings and maintain relationship with others within and across socio-semiotic contexts. Therefore, a semioethnographic approach can enable to draw a holistic picture of the concept of communication and its manifestation across different socio-semiotic contexts. The semioethnographic approach can serve effectively to understand what competencies L2 learners need in order to socialize or acculturate into a given socio-semiotic world on the basis of affective, cognitive, and behavioral axes. Considering the affective, cognitive, and behavioral aspect of ICC, SEMIC can serve effectively as a framework to examine the phenomena of intercultural communication by addressing the competencies that L2 learners need for effective and appropriate navigation in a given socio-semiotic world. The mixed methods convergent parallel research design served effectively as a litmus test for competing theories of ICC and pinpointed SEMIC as an applicable and useful framework to examine L2 learners' ICC. It produced more comprehensive and consistent and reliable conclusions by using different instruments like the ICC, the DCT, and the semi-structured interviews. The current research used production data to measure the informant's intercultural performance. However, future research can use perception data to measure L2 learners' intercultural performance. Since the traditional DCT measures L2 learners' socio-semiopragmatic performance indirectly, the reverse DCT can be used to gauge their performance directly. The contextual cues provided in the DCT scenarios can be enhanced by adding further semiotic variables such as race, religion, time, and so forth. Future research can focus on different communicative events or acts and different groups of L2 learners to examine the phenomenon of intercultural communication. Fostering L2 learners' awareness, knowledge, and ability of intercultural norms and conventions through a socio-semiotically responsive pedagogy is considered of great importance in the L2 classroom. In this regard, cognitive awareness raising and noticing tasks and activities, receptive skill developing tasks and activities through various materials, and productive skill developing tasks and activities can work effectively to promote L2 learners' ICC. To apply this pedagogy in the L2 classroom, the models or frameworks suggested by different scholars and researchers can be used. In these models, such tasks as cultural scripts, culture puzzle, classroom guess, cultural errands, culture assimilators, and cartoons can be used to develop L2 learners' ICC. And finally, we can say that different and various instructional materials should be employed in the L2 classroom, such as authentic podcasts, videos, transcripts of authentic conversations, and so forth. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. Here are my references. Thank you for listening to me. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can see my email addresses on the slide, and you can post me anytime you wish. Thank you.